Imagine camping deep in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by nature's serene beauty, only to encounter something that defies reality, a creature with a horrifying gaze that leaves you questioning your very sanity. Stay with me as I unravel one of the eeriest true encounters from these mysterious woods. I went on a camping trip with my parents, grandparents, and a friend in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina when I was about 16. It was a beautiful fall season, and the trip was filled with the usual joys: campfire food, exploring small town shops, and cracking open geodes to find quartz and amethyst. It was the kind of trip where you feel completely at peace with the world. One night, after a delightful evening of s'mores and board games at my grandparents' camper, my friend and I settled into our bunk beds in my parents' camper. By 1 a.m., everyone else was asleep, but I was still awake, engrossed in a video game and texting my significant other. That's when I heard a rustling sound in the brush outside the camper. I brushed it off, assuming it was just a squirrel or raccoon. This was a national park, after all. Minutes later, there was a loud clanging sound coming from the metal ring around the fire pit. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to peek outside. I slipped on my slides and opened the camper door slightly. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. A deer stood by the fire pit, nudging the grill grate with its snout. Its behavior was odd, almost unnatural, but I chalked it up to illness. I crouched down to retrieve my slides, trying not to disturb the animal, but then it turned its attention toward me. Its dark, huffing breaths were sharp and deliberate, as if warning me to stay back. I was about to retreat when the deer stood up on its hind legs, its knees bent backward in a grotesque, unnatural way. Paralyzed with fear, I shut the door, locked it, and sat frozen in my bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The next morning, I scoured the internet, searching for explanations. Most results pointed to zombie deer virus. But nothing about the disease matched what I had seen. Months later, I stumbled across a story on a channel I follow that described an eerily similar creature, a local legend known as the knot deer. Unlike my encounter, their description included sharp teeth. Time passed, and I tried to push the memory aside. But as a pagan, I couldn't shake the belief that dwelling on something could manifest it. And then, about 8 months ago, it happened again. I was 18, home for winter break, and hanging out with friends. We shared scary stories, and when it was my turn, I recounted my chilling experience. Everyone fell silent. The weight of the tale lingered as I drove home alone that night. About 10 minutes from my house, a deer darted onto the road. I stopped to let it pass, but one stayed behind. It stared directly at me, then stood up on its hind legs, those awful backward bending knees locking in place. Terrified, I floored the gas and reached home in record time. That night, the nightmares began. They plagued me for weeks, each one more vivid and horrifying than the last. The worst came after we let our cats out one sunny day. When we called them back, only one didn't return. My mom asked me to check the woods. We lived in a rural South Carolina town, and while I wasn't worried about people, the woods carried their own dangers. As I called out for our cat, I heard rustling nearby. Then I saw a deer, but not a deer. This one had sharp teeth. It stared at me, its presence suffocating. I screamed, turned, and ran as fast as I could. Once out of the woods, I collapsed, sobbing and apologizing to whatever it was. We never found our cat. I try not to think about what happened that day, but sometimes the nightmares return, and with them, the question. What is this thing? Three friends ventured deep into the Appalachian wilderness for a weekend of camping. only to encounter a creature so horrifying it defies explanation. What starts as an ordinary trip turns into a heart-pounding race for survival. Stay tuned to uncover their terrifying story. For some context, I own 12 acres at the base of the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania. I often camp up in the mountains, enjoying the peace and solitude. This particular story takes place in late July 2015. I was camping with two friends, Robert and Aaron, and my hunting beagle, Judy. We started out around noon, hiking through my property and up the mountain. The hike usually takes about 2 hours, and everything was going smoothly until Judy picked up a scent. She bolted after it, howling loudly and ignoring my commands to return. This was completely out of character for her, as she was well trained. Robert, Aaron, and I chased after her, leaving our intended path and wandering into an unfamiliar area. When we caught up, Judy was standing completely still, staring at something. As we approached, we saw what had caught her attention: a doe, ripped in two, lying by a small stream. The sight was shocking. All three of us were seasoned hunters with about 15 years of experience, but none of us had ever seen anything like this. The mutilation was extreme. We figured it might have been the work of a black bear, though something about it felt off. Judy, usually bold and curious, was terrified. She stayed quiet and on high alert, her demeanor putting us all on edge. We decided to head back to our normal hiking route. As we moved, we heard the sound of footsteps behind us, slow, deliberate, and bipedal. The steps kept a consistent distance of about 100 yards. Feeling uneasy, I drew my Smith Wesson .357 Magnum from its holster and kept it ready. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and we reached our camping spot. By the time we set up camp, the hike had taken 4 hours instead of the usual 2. Judy seemed calmer but still unnerved. After pitching our tents, we got a fire going, cooked some baked beans, and relaxed with a few drinks. As the night deepened, we drifted off to sleep, the earlier events slipping to the back of our minds. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps outside my tent. Judy stood perfectly still, her body tense as if warning me to stay quiet. The forest was eerily silent, no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just a faint, sickening smell of rotting meat. A few minutes later, I heard Robert and Aaron whispering in their tent. Then one of them unzipped their tent and stepped outside, muttering, "Stop messing around." Suddenly, I heard Aaron exclaim, "Holy crap, what the heck is that thing?" I quickly unzipped my tent and stepped out, gun in hand. Judy stayed frozen in the corner of the tent, refusing to budge. Standing behind a tree, partially illuminated by the moonlight, was a towering figure. It had antlers, deep concave eye sockets, and a thin, unsettling smile. Its reddish eyes glowed faintly, and it stood about 9 or 10 feet tall. I didn't hesitate. I raised my Magnum and fired 3 shots center mass. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream that sent chills down my spine before disappearing into the woods. Judy whined, hiding in the corner of the tent, while Aaron and Robert stared at me, their faces pale with terror. Without a word, we began packing up. It didn't take long for us to realize the gravity of what we'd encountered. None of us had ever seen or heard of such a creature in all our years of exploring these forests. As we hurried down the mountain, we could hear it following us, its footsteps unnervingly close. I blindly fired 3 more shots into the darkness, reloaded, and handed Judy to Aaron so I could fire again. After my second round of shots, the creature let out another blood-curdling scream, and the footsteps finally faded. We made it back to my house in record time. the hike taking less than 2 hours despite the treacherous terrain. None of us spoke much after that. Judy, however, was never the same. She refused to enter the woods again and rarely barked or howled. To this day, Robert, Aaron, and I talk about that night, but only among ourselves. We've never shared the story with anyone else until now. Judy's fear serves as a constant reminder that whatever we saw that night wasn't just a figment of our imagination. A quiet hunting trip in the Appalachian Mountains takes a sinister turn when one man stumbles upon an ancient, malevolent force lurking deep in the woods. What happens next is a tale so chilling it will leave you questioning what really dwells in the wilderness. Stick around, this is a story you won't forget. There's not much to do in rural Pennsylvania, what some people call Pennsyltucky. Like in many small towns, the popular pastimes involve drinking too much and racing old trucks down narrow, poorly maintained roads. But for me, hunting was my escape. People think hunting is cruel, but I found peace in the forest that I could never find in the cramped, claustrophobic atmosphere of town. This particular season, I was out in early November, exploring a new area in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, northwest of Harrisburg. The forest was stunning. The fall foliage was still clinging to some trees, glowing in fiery reds and oranges, though most had already withered, signaling an unusually harsh winter ahead. The fallen leaves formed a crunchy carpet underfoot, creating a soft, constant rustle as I walked. I carried my Winchester .30-06 rifle. A bit of overkill for deer hunting, but I always preferred to be prepared in case of larger animals like elk or black bears. This forest was uncharted territory for me, a refreshing change from my usual spots, which had become crowded with subdivisions and paved trails. As I wandered, the sheer beauty of the woods distracted me. I became so engrossed in the scenery that I tripped over a tree root. When I looked up, I saw that it was part of a massive, gnarled oak tree. The trunk was blackened with age and split down the middle, as if lightning had struck it long ago. As I passed the tree, a smell hit me, a thick, coppery stench that made me stop in my tracks. At first, I thought it might be a dead animal, which could mean a bear was nearby. Curious and cautious, I circled the tree to investigate. There was no carcass, but what I saw chilled me. The ground at the base of the tree looked like the site of a massacre. Dark clumps of matted fur were scattered among the underbrush, and a trail of black, viscous fluid led into a hollow under one of the massive roots. The smell was overwhelming, like pennies mixed with decay. It made me gag, something that rarely happens, even after years of gritty hunting experiences. I quickly decided to move on, shaken but determined to continue my hunt. The sun was shining brightly by then, and I tried to focus on the warmth of the day rather than the unsettling scene one just left behind. Around midday, I stopped to eat, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be sitting still. The forest had gone silent, no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. That eerie stillness sank in, and I stood up, scanning the area. Then I heard it. First, a branch snapped a few hundred yards away. Then, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before, a screech so loud and unnatural it seemed to split the earth itself. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely. Terrified, I bolted for my rifle, which was leaning against a tree nearby. I scanned the forest, but the falling leaves formed a curtain, obscuring my view. I couldn't see what was moving toward me, but I knew something was out there. I decided to head back the way I came, forcing myself not to look back. As I moved, the sounds of the forest returned behind me, birds chirping and leaves rustling. But ahead of me it was still dead silent. That's when I realized the creature was circling me, cutting off my path. Panicked, I scrambled off the trail into a rock gully. I found a small cave and crawled inside, pressing my back against the cold, damp rock. My heart was pounding as I tried to stay silent. Minutes passed, and then I heard its slow, deliberate footsteps above me, followed by heavy, choking breaths. The breathing was inhuman. It sounded wet and labored, like something between a growl and a snarl. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me. But then my rifle slipped from my grip and clattered to the ground. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and the footsteps immediately turned toward me. I froze as the creature approached the cave entrance. It stopped just outside, its breathing louder now, almost as if it were sniffing the air. Then I felt at a hand. Not my gun, but a rough, sinewy hand, covered in mud and fur. I gasped, and the creature let out a deafening scream. In a blind panic, I grabbed my rifle, shouldered it, and fired repeatedly. For a split second, I saw a blood-red eye, filled with hatred, and long, yellowed fangs. The creature's malice was ancient and overwhelming. It wasn't just an animal, it was something older, something that didn't belong in this world. I kept firing until I ran out of bullets, my hands trembling as I cycled through my ammo. By the time I stopped, the creature was gone, but the forest still felt heavy, as if it were watching me. I waited in the cave for what felt like hours before crawling out. My legs were shaky, but I forced myself to move. I left most of my gear behind and sprinted back to my truck, not daring to look back. When I finally reached my truck, I drove straight to a motel in town. I spent the night with all the lights on, a bottle of whiskey in hand, trying to block out the memory of that red eye and those fangs. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I hear a faint howl echoing through the trees. It's a reminder that the forest doesn't forget, and neither do I. A couple's peaceful Appalachian Trail hike turns into a waking nightmare when mysterious figures start stalking them in the dead of night. What unfolds will make you think twice before venturing into the wilderness alone. Stick around, this is one story you won't want to miss. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I, having hiked other sections of the Appalachian Trail, decided to try the southern portion of Virginia's trail. This stretch, about 166 miles long, runs through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, from Roanoke County to Pearisburg and Giles County. It's one of the most remote and less traveled parts of the trail, exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and started our journey at the Virginia Creeper Trail, planning to finish in Damascus. By the time we'd reached the end, we figured we'd be more than ready to return to the comfort of our beds. It was early October, and the trail was breathtaking. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of red, orange, and gold, and the crisp, cool air made for perfect hiking weather. The first part of the trip was uneventful, just your typical hike. But it was during the last couple of nights that things took a strange and terrifying turn. On this section of the trail, you're supposed to camp on the trail itself, or at designated shelters. We, however, wanted more privacy. After some searching, we found a small clearing off the trail. It seemed perfect, secluded, peaceful, and quiet. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked for a while, and then went to bed. At around 2 a.m., my girlfriend woke me up, shaking me. She whispered, "Get your gun. Someone's walking around outside the tent." She explained that she'd woken up to what sounded like someone circling the tent, running a knife or something sharp along the fabric. My heart raced as I grabbed my 1911 handgun and sat up, listening. The night was eerily silent. After a few minutes, I heard it a snap, crunch, snap. Someone or something was walking through the woods behind our tent. Quietly, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way out. The fire had gone out, leaving the area pitch black except for the dim light of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay inside while I checked it out. I didn't turn on the flashlight right away, not wanting to give away my position. I waited, listening for more sounds. Then I heard it again snap, crunch. The steps were deliberate and paced like a person's. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. For a moment I thought I saw a figure move behind a tree. I yelled, "Whoever you are, get out of here. I'm armed." My voice echoed through the woods. Suddenly I heard running branches snapping and leaves crunching as something bolted away. I turned to follow the sound, but then I heard movement from the original spot. Someone else was there. I wasn't about to give chase, so I backed up to the tent, flashlight in one hand and gun in the other. I told my girlfriend what had happened, and we sat in silence, too scared to sleep. I stayed on guard outside the tent until morning. When daylight finally came, I searched the area for signs of who or what had been there. That's when I found it, a single boot print in the soft dirt near the tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my girlfriend's. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I didn't want to scare her any more than she already was. But deep down, I knew we weren't alone out there. We packed up quickly and hiked faster than usual that day, covering as much ground as possible. When it came time to camp again, I chose a spot near a cliff with a small overhang. I figured it would give us some protection and prevent anyone from sneaking up behind us. That entire day, I had the unsettling feeling that we were being watched. I didn't see anyone, but the sensation was there, a gut instinct I couldn't shake. We set up camp, cooked, and tried to relax, though neither of us felt at ease. I gave my girlfriend the 1911 and kept my Judge revolver within arm's reach. I told her I'd keep watch, but exhaustion eventually got the better of me, and I drifted off. I woke up sometime later to the sound of rustling outside the tent. My girlfriend was already awake, clutching the 1911. She whispered, "There's someone out there." From the faint glow of the dying fire, I saw a silhouette near our gear. I yelled, "We're armed. Get out of here." The figure froze, then bolted into the woods. I stepped out of the tent, gun drawn, and scanned the area. Our belongings were scattered. Whoever it was had rummaged through our things. As I walked toward the creek nearby, I noticed a flickering light in the distance. It looked like a lantern. Then 2 more lights appeared, followed by a third. Panic set in. I told my girlfriend to start packing up. "We're leaving now," I said. We grabbed our essentials, left the tent behind, and headed back to the trail in the middle of the night. The whole way I could hear faint voices and branches snapping in the woods around us. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone or something to appear. As the sun started to rise, we were about a mile from the end of the trail. That's when I saw a figure stepping onto the trail behind us. It just stood there watching. I stopped and called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" But it didn't respond. After a moment, it turned and disappeared back into the woods. We didn't stop until we reached the car. Exhausted and shaken, we drove away, leaving the Appalachian wilderness behind. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe it was something far more sinister. All I know is I'll never go back to that section of the trail again. An ordinary hiking trip turned into a nightmare when a chilling predator emerged from the shadows. This harrowing tale of survival and loss will leave you speechless. In late spring of 1986, Becca White, a graduate student in business administration at Virginia Tech, sat down for breakfast in the university cafeteria. Becca was a hardworking and diligent young woman, but her focus on studies often left her feeling isolated and longing for companionship. That's why she felt pure joy when Claudia Brenner, a Manhattan-born architecture student, approached her and asked, "Is this seat taken?" What followed was the love affair of a lifetime. As they got to know each other, Becca and Claudia realized they were perfect together. Both were intelligent, ambitious women who shared a love for the outdoors. Over the next 2 years, their bond deepened, and they took every opportunity to explore some of the most beautiful hiking trails the Appalachians had to offer. In May of 1988, they decided to visit Myco State Forest in Pennsylvania, an 850,000-acre expanse of wilderness that includes a section of the Appalachian Trail. They packed their car, left Virginia Tech, and drove north, singing along to the radio and enjoying road snacks. Eventually, they found a place to park and headed into the forest. The parking spot had a name that, in hindsight, feels haunting Dead Woman's Hollow. About an hour into their hike, the couple came across one of several primitive campsites scattered along the southern slopes of the Appalachian Hills. They continued hiking until they found the perfect spot to pitch their tent. After setting up camp, Becca excused herself to use the campground's bathroom. On her way, she was startled by a man lurking near the small wooden facility. His appearance was unnerving, wild, unkempt hair, a gaunt face, filthy clothes, and dirt-caked fingernails. The man grinned at Becca and asked for a cigarette. She politely told him she didn't smoke and quickly walked back to the campsite. Becca shared the encounter with Claudia, admitting she felt uneasy. Claudia suggested they pack up and move to another campsite further down the trail, and Becca agreed. They dismantled their tent and hiked on. As they walked, they stopped occasionally to check their map and scan their surroundings. Each time they looked back, they noticed the man from earlier. He was following them. The realization sent a chill through them. Picking up their pace, they tried to lose him. Finally, after not seeing him for a while, they felt safe enough to set up camp at another primitive site. They prepared dinner and began to relax as the woods around them grew quiet and still. The couple, convinced they were alone, began to enjoy the moment. They cuddled, watching the sunset paint the horizon with shades of orange and pink. For a brief time, they felt at peace. But they were not alone. Unbeknownst to them, the man had tracked them through the forest. He returned to a cave he called home to retrieve a .22 caliber rifle he had hidden there. With the rifle in hand, he crept back toward their camp, moving silently through the shadows. As Becca and Claudia prepared to retire for the night, the man raised his rifle. He fired 8 shots. 5 bullets tore through Claudia, breaking her arm, shattering her face, cracking her skull, and puncturing her neck. The other 3 struck Becca, grazing her head, ripping through her back, and puncturing her liver. After firing, the man fled into the woods, laughing and whooping as if the attack were a twisted game. He believed there was no way either woman could survive. But he was wrong. Despite her critical injuries, Becca managed to stand. Through tears of pain and fear, she promised Claudia she would get help. She would get help. She then limped 3 miles down the trail until she reached a road. A passing driver saw her and rushed her to the Shippensburg police station. Becca described the attack and the location of their campsite before being taken to the hospital. Tragically, Claudia succumbed to her injuries before help could arrive. At the crime scene, police found 25 unfired .22 caliber bullets and a knit cap, which they believed belonged to the attacker. Becca's detailed description of the man led police to focus their search, but he remained elusive for days. Then, a break came. A group of Old Order Mennonites living near the forest had recently encountered a man named Stephen Roy Carr. He had approached their community, expressing interest in joining them. The Mennonites, who generally avoided contact with modern society, welcomed him cautiously. One member of the group secretly owned a television, which he used to watch the news. When a broadcast showed a sketch of the suspect, he immediately recognized Carr as the man staying in their community. The Mennonite informed local authorities, and a plan was devised to capture Carr without alarming him. The Mennonites invited him to dinner, and as Carr sat down to eat, police swarmed the home and arrested him. Carr confessed, claiming he was enraged by the sight of 2 women being intimate. He even suggested their actions were meant to provoke him, using a homophobic defense to justify his attack. The judge dismissed his claims and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, Becca White became an advocate for LGBTQ+ rights and a voice against hate crimes. She wrote a book detailing the attack and has since worked to raise awareness of anti-gay violence. Though times have changed and public acceptance of LGBTQ+ individuals has grown, the memory of that day serves as a reminder. Love should never provoke hate, and no one should fear for their lives because of who they are. Ever been deep in the woods and felt like someone or something was watching you? This chilling encounter will make you think twice about hiking alone. I grew up in a small, cold town in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a wonderful place for an outdoorsy kid like me. We had no immediate neighbors, and there were acres of forest to explore. Above our house, a ridge bordered a state park. The park's trails and public areas were far below in the valley, separated by thick woods and plenty of no trespassing signs. It was rare to see hikers cross onto our land. A dirt road wound up the mountain to the ridge, where the remains of a burnt-down cabin stood. Following the ridge led to a flat area popular with local hunters. My dad and his friends often used it, even posting a trail camera in the off-season to monitor wildlife. We had coyotes, the occasional bear, mountain lions, which the Department of Natural Resources still refused to acknowledge, bobcats, and plenty of deer. If you continued up the ridge, you'd find a clearing with flat boulders and a giant electrical tower that was fun to climb. I often went there with our family's black lab, Felicia, to read, climb, and enjoy the outdoors. One early fall day when I was 13, I packed snacks and a book and hiked up there. I carefully avoided the trail cam because it was one of those old film types, and I'd gotten in trouble before for accidentally using up all the film. I reached my favorite rock near the power lines and settled down to read. Felicia suddenly started barking and growling aggressively. I thought she was chasing a deer, but she didn't run off. Instead, she stayed next to me, growling at something unseen in the thick brush. I considered hiking in that direction before but knew it was tough terrain. The area had been cleared for the electrical tower, and afterward a mass of briars and weeds had taken over, making the slopes treacherous. Then I saw someone fighting their way through the brush from that direction. Nervously, I called out, "Hello," and gripped Felicia's collar. She had a habit of jumping on people when excited, and I didn't want her to knock him down the slope. The man looked up, smiled, and climbed the hill to the base of my rock. Something about him felt off. He was in his mid to late 20s, of average height and build, wearing hiker attire, but with no backpack or supplies. Felicia snarled at him, but he didn't seem fazed. "Hi there," he said. "Where did you come from?" "I live just down the hill," I replied. "I was hiking with my dog." "Oh, she seems like a nice dog," he said, ignoring Felicia's snarls. "You should have her on a leash, though. Wouldn't want to get in trouble with the park," I replied. "We only leash her in the park. This is our property." The man didn't react to the fact that he was trespassing. Instead, he said, "Still, you're so close. You never know who might come this way. No one from the park comes here," I said, feeling annoyed. "I'm from the park," he said. "One of the rangers. I wanted to see the property. What would you have done if she'd attacked me?" "You could get into big trouble." A chill ran down my spine. Our family knew the park ranger, and this man wasn't him, but I didn't want to let on that I knew he was lying. I clipped Felicia's leash, stood up, and said, "Sorry. I'll let you get on with your hike. I have to go home now." "Do your parents know you're up here?" he asked. "Oh yeah." I lied. "My dad comes up here often to check the trail cams." At that, the man's smile faltered. "Trail cams?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Lots of them. My dad and his friends like to go hunting." His smile returned, but it was colder now. "Well, these would make excellent hunting grounds," he said, taking a step toward me. Felicia lunged, nearly yanking the leash out of my hands. The man didn't flinch. "You should head back now. Keep a tight hold on that leash. Maybe I'll see you up here again sometime." "Yeah, maybe," I said, thinking I'd never hike there again. I quickly dragged Felicia away. The man stood motionless, watching me with a strange smile until I was out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached the road leading home. I didn't tell my parents about the encounter at first, worried they'd forbid me from hiking alone. By the end of the week, I had convinced myself I'd overreacted. But when my dad's friend developed the film from the trail cam, there was a photo of me and Felicia crossing the clearing and nothing else. The man never reappeared, but that encounter left a mark. To this day, whenever I hike, I always bring a dog and make sure to wave at every trail cam I see. What would you do if a routine work trip in the wilderness turned into a terrifying encounter with gunfire and a stranger lurking in the dark? This chilling story will leave you questioning every step into the unknown. When I was 26, working as a biologist, I spent a lot of time alone in remote locations. This particular incident happened in the Appalachian Mountains, a place I knew well but could still surprise me in the worst ways. I was surveying wetlands in a remote area dominated by thick pine forests. Before heading out, I had printed a map from the county assessor's site to ensure I wouldn't trespass. Out here, people don't just ask questions, they act first. The site I was working at had a private driveway running through Forest Service land, making access quicker. To be clear, the driveway was public property, so I wasn't trespassing. I parked my government-marked vehicle 30 yards from a privacy gate, then set off into the woods. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth at the edges and open spaces beneath the towering pine trees. About 200 yards in, nature called. As I was taking care of business, I suddenly heard yelling near my truck. Great, I thought, now I have to deal with this. Before I could head back, gunshots rang out. I froze, heart racing. I wasn't ready to go back to my truck if someone was shooting. Then I heard movement. Someone was coming through the undergrowth at the forest's edge. Panic set in. This was public property, but that didn't matter here. People disappear in places like this. I took off, jogging deeper into the forest, using my sense of direction to head for the main road about 600 yards away. More gunshots echoed in my direction. There was no way they could see me, but they must have heard me. My adrenaline kicked in, and I pushed myself to move faster, not daring to look back. Finally, I reached the main road and hid under a nearby bridge. I called a colleague to tell them where I was, just in case I didn't make it out. Then, for the first time in my career, I dialed 911. The operator didn't seem to take me seriously, but I persisted. Eventually, a deputy contacted me. His dismissive tone frustrated me even more. "They're probably just shooting at tin cans," he said. It was 7 p.m. on a Saturday, and he sounded too lazy to investigate. I decided to move further into a public hunting area, putting more distance between me and the danger. Thankfully, a game warden stopped me. Unlike the deputy, he believed my story. As we talked, a few locals passed by, muttering about how the landowner near the gate was notorious for being difficult. This made sense now. Most locals were friendly, but this one clearly wasn't. After about an hour, the deputy finally arrived and offered to escort me back to my vehicle. When we got there, we saw an ATV parked by my truck. A man sat on it, holding a rifle across his lap, waiting. The deputy and I got out of the car. Without a word, I walked straight to my truck and left. It was 9 p.m. By then, and I had a 4-hour drive home. I didn't stick around to ask questions, but I often wonder what the man and the deputy talked about after I left. That encounter left me shaken. I started carrying a firearm in the field from then on, trusting my gut every time I stepped into the wilderness. It wasn't the kind of conversation I ever wanted to have with someone who seemed far too ready to pull the trigger. I had all the man's contact information and thought about mailing him a map clearly outlining where his property started and ended, but deep down I knew it wouldn't matter. Some people don't care about boundaries, and it's better to walk away. Imagine camping in the wilderness, only to wake up to the sound of someone circling your tent with a knife. This true story of survival will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to hike the southern portion of Virginia's Appalachian Trail. The trail runs for 166 miles through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, from Roanoke County to Giles County. It's one of the less traveled, more remote sections of the trail, which was exactly what we wanted. It was early October. The air was cool, crisp, and perfect for hiking, while the changing leaves painted the forest in stunning colors. Most of the trip was uneventful, just a beautiful hike through the wilderness. But our last couple of nights on the trail were anything but ordinary. On this part of the trail, campers are supposed to use designated shelters just off the path. However, we wanted privacy and didn't want anyone stumbling upon us in the middle of the night. So we ignored the rules and found our own secluded spot off the trail. After some searching, we discovered a small clearing. It seemed perfect. We set up camp, cooked dinner, and spent the evening talking before settling in for the night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to my girlfriend shaking me. "Get your gun," she whispered. "Someone is walking around outside the tent." She explained that she had been woken by the sound of a knife being dragged along the side of our tent, circling us. I always carry my 1911 and a judge when hiking in remote areas. You never know who or what you might encounter. I grabbed the judge from my pack, and we sat silently listening. At first, there was only the sound of the breeze rustling through the trees, but then we heard it. Faint footsteps in the forest behind our tent. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully stepped outside, telling my girlfriend to stay put. The fire had gone out, leaving the area almost pitch black. Only the dim glow of the October moon provided light. I didn't turn on the flashlight right away, not wanting to give away my position. Instead, I waited, listening for the sound again. After a few minutes, I heard its slow, deliberate steps. They sounded bipedal, like a person. I switched on the flashlight and scanned the area. For a moment, I thought I saw movement behind a tree. "Who's there?" I called out. "Go away. I'm armed." I kept the beam fixed on the spot where I thought I saw the figure and slowly moved closer. Suddenly, from my right, I heard the sound of someone running. I spun toward the noise, but just as I did, the figure behind the tree also bolted into the forest. I wasn't about to give chase. I returned to the tent and told my girlfriend what happened. We decided I'd stand guard for the rest of the night. The following morning, I searched the area. Not far from our tent, I found a boot print in the soft dirt. It wasn't mine or my girlfriend's. Someone had definitely been out there stalking us. I didn't tell her about the boot print. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. Instead, we packed up and moved quickly, covering as much ground as we could during the day. That night, we camped near a cliff with a small overhang, making it impossible for anyone to approach us from behind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. After dinner, we went into the tent. I gave my girlfriend the 1911 while I kept the judge close. I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. Eventually, she drifted off, but I stayed awake, listening to every sound in the forest. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally caught up with me. I woke sometime later to the sound of someone rummaging through our belongings. I quickly grabbed my gun and motioned for my girlfriend to stay quiet. The faint glow of the dying fire cast a shadow on our tent. A person was standing just outside. "We're armed," I shouted. "Get out of here." The figure froze for a moment, then bolted into the woods. I stepped out of the tent, gun drawn, and saw that our gear had been scattered everywhere. I walked toward the edge of the woods and saw a flickering light down by the creek. It looked like a lantern. Then 3 more lights appeared, moving along the other side of the creek. "We're leaving now," I told my girlfriend. We packed up what we could, leaving behind the tent and a few other items and headed back to the trail. It was the middle of the night, and I kept hearing snapping branches and faint voices in the forest. Every few seconds I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following us. After hours of walking, the sun began to rise. We rounded a corner, and I turned to look back. That's when I saw someone step out onto the trail behind us. They just stood there watching. "Who are you?" I called out. "What do you want?" They didn't respond, just silently stared before turning and disappearing into the woods. We picked up the pace, not stopping until we reached the trail's end. When we finally got to my girlfriend's car, we were exhausted but relieved. I still don't know who those people were or what they wanted. Were they just messing with us, or was it something far more sinister? One thing's for sure, I won't be going back to that part of the trail anytime soon.